Welcome to the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and we are back with another episode of the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I am your host, Josh Luck, and I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Jacob Sklenar. Jacob, how you doing?
I am great. I'm really excited to get in this one today. We've been waiting pretty much since the last time we got off with this guest to talk to him again.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to get right into introducing who we're talking to on this episode, and that is Dr. Bronson Strickland. Bronson, how you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Good to see you guys again.
Yes.
Likewise.
We have been very excited to record this episode with you. And last time we recorded was actually for this series, last fall. If anyone wants to go back and listen to that, that is episode 205. It's titled Buck Behavior According to the Research. And we went over kind of buck behavior, buck movement throughout the entire year. And that was based on your guys' publication. It came out in 2023, correct?
Believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. It's titled Understanding Buck Movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So today on this episode, what we're going to get into is an analysis from that data set from Understanding Buck Movement, that publication. But we're going to dive into it a little bit more and focus on weather and some of the weather data around that. But before we get into that, I kind of want to set the stage a little bit before we get into some of the specifics. And then even before that, Bronson, you've had some new developments in your life recently, and starting a new business in that. Can you get into some of that and tell the listeners what you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had 25 years at Mississippi State, and so I'm in a transition phase right now. So I'm no longer a full-time professor or researcher. I'm part-time right now, and ramping up a land management consulting business with myself and several others. And I guess to put it succinctly, it's taking all of the research that we have done over the years and applying it for people, based on their objectives. But it's the things that we know that are research verified, the things that matter, and things that we can do to be proactive. And then we're helping people, guiding them in how to manage their property to reach their objectives. And me and Steve Damaris, for example, we're working together for all the deer population stuff, deer management stuff. We've got people like Marcus Lashley and Will Goolsby. They're on board doing wild turkey stuff. So we really have a really unique group of people that can handle just about any type of game management issue or problem or improvement you want to make on your property.
Yeah, I've been following along the Instagram page for that, and I've been enjoying you guys did where you kind of introduced everyone on the team and some of the stuff that you guys do, and then even I think you had some graphics and stuff showing some of the research that you guys are employing and your strategies in that. I'm really excited to see where it goes, because to my knowledge, and I could be wrong here, but to my knowledge, I don't know if there's another land consulting company out there like it. Not to say that there are not some very good ones,
right?
But I don't know of any that really applies the tried and true research that has been studied for a long time and then applies that to it.
Yeah, and it's really fun for us. All of us are either finishing up their career in research, and some are still in it. But it's really interesting for me. My story is I've spent so much time doing the research and trying to figure out the system and deer management and so forth, having a lot of fun now putting it in place. And so rather than just research and telling people about it on the podcast on Deer University and things like that, it is really fun and gratifying to see it in action on people's properties. So getting a lot of good feedback from that.
Yeah, it's full circle in your career.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's an awesome transition to be in. Congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll go ahead and kind of get into some of the data that you guys took a look at for the weather. But I want to, and I heard you had I think it was you and Dr. Damaris had discussed this on the podcast you guys did on the weather data. But you had briefly mentioned some of the research in the past when it comes to weather and its effects on deer movement. And I kind of want to hit on this a little bit before we go into this current research. So for our listeners in general, could you give them an idea of what the research has suggested in the past when it comes to this?
Yeah, if you dig deep and go way back, and I mean the 60s and maybe even pre-60s, I mean, there is some stuff in the literature that's looking at the impacts of weather. But I would, I guess, generalize by saying the methods are better now. And what I mean by that, it might be good research for the day, meaning they did a systematic approach. It might be that they drove and did spotlight counts, systematically throughout the year, and then correlating it back to different types of weather. It might be related to harvest data at a check station. When are we seeing the greatest return? So kind of that indirect effect of, we're assuming if more deer were killed, more deer were moving and sighted, and so forth. And then even with the advent of collars and telemetry and so forth, I did some of that stuff when I was a graduate student with VHF collars. And with that, it's precision. So I was the guy, standing out there beside the truck with a receiver in one ear and an antenna, but you don't get the number of locations with that. You might get one a day, two, or certainly no more than 3 a day. And also, when a buck leaves the study area and you can't find him with your antenna, you can't find him. Yeah. And so he may be gone for a month, and you lose him, or he may have been killed or whatever. And so then we move into what I think is one of the best ways to look at this, to monitor the animal. Then we get with GPS collars. Well, then you have to go with how many bucks do you have collared? And so did you only have 10 animals? And you can learn a lot from having 10 animals collared. But do you have 30, 40, 50 animals? And how often are you getting locations? So remember, there's a trade-off when you do a study. Mm-hmm. If I want a longer duration, if I want that battery to last a long time, I can't get as many dings. I can't get as many locations. So when you start fine-tuning that to getting locations every 5, 10, 15 minutes, you're doing it really intensively. And then if you do that for a great number of deer over a year or two, like we did, you can learn a lot. And it sets yourself up to have a data set that's really conducive to seeing fine scale changes that you can detect that you would probably miss with more coarse data.
Yeah. So admittedly, when I was younger, I didn't look as much into deer research in general, but I did hear people talk about oh, well, the research doesn't show there's any effect on weather. But it always seemed like most of the hunters when I was growing up would always say oh, those cold fronts, you got to hunt those cold fronts. You get more deer movement in general when you have those. So there was always conflicting information that I was getting growing up. And then, just me hunting anecdotally, what I'm seeing out in the field, it did seem like, when there were changes in the weather, when we get these cold fronts coming, the movement I would see would be a little bit more, right? So I do still base my hunting around some of those cold fronts. That's why I was really excited when we have these new technologies now, and then you guys analyze this data and it was showing some of that. So that was very exciting to see.
Yeah, Josh, I also want to point out, because you talked about kind of the conventional wisdom in hunting being the cold fronts as well. One conventional wisdom item that we're probably going to talk about a lot today is that hunting in the morning is no good until later in the season in the rut. And that's something that I think, Josh, you and I in particular have refuted through some research and experience for a long time. But the data and the research are going to give a lot of credence to that in this case. And Josh, I think you and I can put some logic behind it as well if we're going to assign some human wisdom to an animal. We're going to try and do that, but I think it's a little more universal than a mentality where that might not apply. And Josh, I was wondering if you would approve this for me, if we could start
What
potentially
are
with the conclusions of this study and kind of draw people into, hey, this is what we've come away with, and then build in reverse from that point.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Do you mind to do that, Bronson?
That's fine.
Yeah. So let's. Yeah, you take it away, Jacob.
Yeah, I think it's good for people to see. You know, a lot of times in these podcasts, we have a really great point, some awesome conclusions that are reached from the data that maybe someone that's not really well versed in understanding it, or maybe has the time or desire to listen to the entire conversation, they won't even capture that information if they don't make it that far into the podcast. And with every kind of media you put out, spoiler alert, you're after the peak or after the beginning, you almost always linearly or sometimes at a much greater rate drop off in viewership. So yeah, everyone's got to get off the video at some point. And you guys might want to stick around to hear some of these points, but I'm going to share a screen really quick here. And 1 second. So if you guys don't know, we have this podcast on YouTube as well. And we love to do this, especially when we're showing data. We can show you the graphs. We can show you how it actually lines up. But the conclusions of the data that we are going to go through today, if you're curious about wondering how we get there, stick around. But 4 conclusions: that bucks are most active 2 hours after legal shooting light opens and 1 hour after it ends. In other words, your movement window is greatest during legal hours in regards to the morning. But if you're hunting in the afternoon, your greatest movement window is an hour after you already have to get out of the tree stand. So that point is proven in really excellent ways through graphics that are pretty easy to read. Earlier in the study, we will later in the episode. Bucks are more active in low temperatures. Shocker to anyone, right? Bucks are choosing to bed down earlier and leave their bed earlier in low temperatures. So bucks are choosing to bed before shooting time or with maybe some little time during shooting time, but also they're choosing to leave their bed earlier, which would be advantageous to hunters in the afternoon in low temperatures. And activity changes are more dramatic as the rut changes. So the rut changing influences activity quite a bit, but weather types also have an impact as well. It might not be to the same extent that the rut does, but it most certainly has an impact. And that's where the data gets really, really interesting. And we're going to get that kind of at the end of the podcast here, where you can kind of use weather and you can use the rut and then use them together to optimize your chances of having buck movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some 4 really good points, and we'll talk about the nuances and stuff with all that, and how the data kind of tease that out. So Dr. Strickland, could you kind of give our listeners a general overview of how this kind of weather analysis was conducted, how you guys kind of constructed and designed it?
Yeah, I'll try to. And full disclosure, it's been several months since I've really been in this with when we recorded that episode. Gosh, 3, 4, 5 months ago. I haven't been as deeply into it, but I'll do my best. First thing where we want to start is, I think what made this unique, and you have to have a lot of data to do it this way, is every buck is an individual, just like humans are individuals, and if you deer hunt long enough, you've seen that too, but they're individuals. So how do we control for that? You can mathematically come up with some scenarios where some bucks are moving relative to some type of weather pattern. The other half of the population is not. And when you take the average of that, it does not, really look like you have an effect. So what was really important was making establishing a pattern for every single buck and comparing whatever activity you're looking at, you compare it to his normal. And so Natasha's a mathematician. And so she was the brainchild behind the coding and the way to do all this. But it's essentially for every single hour of every single day, she created a moving window for that buck. And so when you go to a particular day and to a particular hour, you are able to look at, is that buck moving below average, average, or above average, and the extent of that by comparing a buck to himself. So you do that, and then you do that for every single buck, and that is how you come up with, on average, bucks are doing this or they're doing that. So every buck is compared to himself, his normal patterns. So then it's, once you lay that out for every hour of every day for every buck, now you can start testing it against some different, weather patterns, weather phenomenon, and stuff like that. So that's essentially how we approached it. And, and you start proposing hypotheses, what things are reasonable or not. And we just kind of looked at all of the major, what we think would influence, environmentally buck movement. And we just systematically went through those, and Natasha compared all of those.
Yeah. For those that may not understand that, that's a lot of math.
That's a lot of
It's
math.
a lot of math.
Yeah.
You guys,
and what you're referring to, sorry, Josh, I wanted to cite our sources here.
Go ahead.
What Dr. Strickland here is referring to is Deer University episode 82, titled "Effects on Weather and Buck Movements." You guys can check that out on the MSU Deer Lab TV YouTube channel. And in this episode, he sits down with Natasha Neary, Luke Resop, Steve Damaris, and himself, Dr. Bronson Strickland, and they discuss all of these different things with the people that work to help gather and actually break down all this, which you just heard is a lot of work.
Yes. The first, correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Strickland, but I believe essentially the first half of that is discussing how you guys established kind of a norm or baseline for all the bucks, and then broke down the data, which is important. You have to define that, because there are natural times during the day in which buck movement would be more, dawn and dusk. And then there are times during the year that buck movement is also higher, right? During the rut, for example. So you really have to figure out what, quote unquote, your baseline or norm is to understand any external factors that may affect that. And that takes a lot. And just for reference, you guys had, was it 60 bucks in this study?
Yeah, it might depend on the month of the year. Some bucks are falling out and they get killed or something like that. But at any given time, it was, 55 to 60 bucks usually. The average age, we had a couple of them that were 2-year-olds. We probably had a couple of them that were 7, but most of them were that 3, 4, 5.
That's a lot of data. 60 bucks every hour, every day. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And that was spread over about 50,000 acres. So pretty big study area.
Yeah, and those are, and just to make this clear for listeners, it's not high fence, nothing like that. This is an area where the deer are hunted or can be hunted.
That's right. Private land, but completely free range.
Yeah. Okay. Just want to make sure that's clear to the listeners, because some people are like, well, if it's high fence, it's not a real life situation. And that's about as real as we can get with this.
That's right.
And what region was this in, just for the listeners?
Central Mississippi. Yeah.
So there's plenty of hunt clubs probably and stuff like that overlap. And we have definitely talked about many times differences in pressure between public and private, and how there is no general rule that encapsulates all the examples. So pretty much any scale of pressure that you can imagine, as low or as high as you want, was probably encapsulated in this study.
It was property specific and time of the year and the weekend and all that sort of stuff. But I would say it is a very normal private land hunting club type environment.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a pretty good representation compared to where most people would generally hunt. Now there are going to be some outliers. If it's really heavy pressured public lands, then that may differ a little bit. But
sure,
I think it's in general a good representation. So once you guys established kind of a buck's norm and the baseline movement rates, which Jacob, if you want, I think we do have some slides on that perhaps.
Yeah, go ahead and share real quick.
How did you guys tease out as far as the weather goes? Like what factors to look at and how it affects movement?
Well, so it all depends on the type of weather. For example, with temperature, we could actually use the data from the buck's collar, what called collar temperature. Of course, if we're going to look at wind, humidity, barometric pressure, all that sort of stuff, that is just going to the nearest data station, weather station, excuse me, and just downloading that. A lot of those data sets are hour by hour. So, certainly several times a day, but sometimes hour by hour. And so, we would just feed that in and compare, where do we see responses or not. So it's just typical statistics at that point where you're just making the comparisons. Do you see a significant difference? If you do find a significant difference, what is the effect size? What is the deviation from norm?
I gotcha.
Yeah. And I kind of want to point out, when we talked about pressure and stuff like that, I kind of want to point out that I don't think it is super important necessarily. I don't think it's extremely necessary for you to have the exact same pressure in your study as someone's environment of hunting, because the results of this study will be proportionate to whatever probably amount of pressure you have in comparison. So what that means is basically, if you are at a situation that has got 100% of the highest pressure, and you're looking at this study that we've presented to you, and it's got 50% of the pressure that you have, and they're showing a relationship with temperature that is resulting in 50% more movement, you could imagine that in your situation to be half of that, assuming you have twice the pressure, so 25% more movement. That might not work out exactly like that, but you could probably assume that the results are proportionate to your situation. So if you're looking for, because this is biologically ideal for a deer in these given situations, it's probably going to be biologically ideal for the deer in your situation. It might not have the same extent, but if you're trying to optimize your chances in your situation, the same logic will follow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have to put everything into context when you're looking at the research, and you have to look at it from your specific situation, which is part of one of the things I want to do with this series, and get people to realize, like, you can utilize the research. You just have to put it in context to your situation and understand that there might be nuances, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Jacob, I would add to what you said is that, one thing with these data that is different if you were doing, say, an observation study, or it might be a camera study where a lot of people are looking at the data of what, we got photographs, and those are all good. I'm not discounting that at all. But what we found in a previous study conducted in Oklahoma was that there was a lot less variation in the movement rate of the bucks. It was more about where the bucks moved, meaning a buck can still cover 300 yards that morning, but if he knows he's being pressured and the buck has patterned the hunter, the buck is still going to move that 300 yards unbeknownst to you. He's in a different area, or he stays in cover, things like that. So some of the same movement patterns could be going on in a more pressured environment. They just might be moving in a place where they know they're safe to move.
Yep. That's a really good
great point.
Yeah, because I feel like I see that in areas that I hunt that have high pressure. It's the deer is still moving. It's just not where hunters are. Right? They're very good at avoiding pressure.
Yeah.
And I don't know if y'all saw this in one of the episodes, but that was something Natasha looked at, looking at arrival times in the afternoon of bucks to food plots and the time of day. And so just very generally here, when you start at the beginning of, say, archery season and go all the way to the end of gun season, it's almost a linear decline of when they are coming. So their normal arrival might be an hour before sundown during bow season, and then the repeated exposure to hunting pressure over time. And when you get to the end of gun season, that's when, on average, most of them are showing up an hour after sunset.
Yeah.
That could be completely biological. And if you removed hunting out of the equation, you may see the exact same scenario. but I bet it's related to people hunting on food plots and bumping them.
Yeah.
I'd bet money on that.
That's one thing that I've put out in many videos of my own with scouting and talked about many times, and we've talked about on this podcast, is proximity to access and proximity to popular hunting spots, and particularly bedding in relation to them. Like the further we get away from when we're identifying beds, and the beds are further away from access and further away from popular hunting spots, because those are two different things. Both of them are a hub of human activity, but the popular hunting spot might still be 2 miles back. It might be really far from the lot, but it's still a popular spot because it looks great. So the more that we see bedding far from those two locations, the more we see it being used later in the year. And sometimes that is, a lot of the time, that is despite whatever food sources are nearby. So they may be getting further from a late season food source as the season goes on, but their number one job is to stay alive.
That's right.
So they may have to work a little harder to get to that food source. They may still be exhausted because of the rut, but they're not going to put themselves under a deer stand to do so, to refuel.
Right.
And that nose doesn't lie. It tells them where the people are and where they've been, and they will not go near that because it means their death.
Yep.
So
That's right.
Jacob, can you scroll down here?
Yeah. Do we
Where
want
it
to touch
gets
on these
into
averages at all?
What's that?
Do we want to touch on these year-round averages at all? We'll
get there. I want to hit on first some definitions here, like the tropical dry, tropical moist, polar dry, polar moist.
Below.
Because this is kind of defines some things for people here. We'll define this, and then what we looked at as far as, or what you guys looked at, Bronson, with defining movement rates and bedding rates. So could you kind of just give a background of why you guys use these definitions here?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is what's one of the good things of living in a university town and having colleagues that have areas of research different from yours, is you get to learn different things and the way they approach science and so forth. So short story, this all came about with me having a neighbor that was in geosciences and meteorology. So he was a weather professor and researcher. And so we're cooking out one night and I'm telling him about what we're doing and how I'm so overwhelmed and it's so multivariate, all these different variables, and how do we summarize them? And he's like, well, he being a weather expert was like, well, we don't do that. That's almost silly that you would think you could do that. I go, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, a lot of those things are correlated. So we just group them into what we non-weather people would probably just say types of fronts, types of weather fronts. There's kind of a package of these variables that come together in this front, and they break them down, as you can see on the screen. It's basically related to temperature and moisture and all the different subsets of that. So you've got a tropical. So for us in the South, that's when it's hot and dry, no rain. And then for us, very commonly, if we have a southern wind and moisture is coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, that's going to be your classic tropical moist. So that's that warm front coming out of the south off the Gulf. And then there's moderate, there's in between. And then the one that excites everyone, me included, is then the polar. So that's when we have that shift coming from the north, and that's either going to be with precipitation or not. But then bundled within polar dry, there's also going to be symmetrics for humidity. There's going to be symmetrics for the wind speed and the wind direction. So basically, when you say polar dry, that is kind of a group of weather variables that most often come together with that front. And so oftentimes it's just a lot easier to compare it against one of those fronts than try to compare it against every single type of weather variable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. And when I was listening to you guys discuss this, I mean, I had never thought of it in that way. I feel like most, I don't know if I should say most, but a lot of hunters, especially if you're listening or watching different things, you'll hear like people talk about just individual aspects, right? Barometric pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speeds, etc. Right, and like you said, a lot of those are correlated, and they kind of can occur around the same time. So I think these are really good definitions because it encompasses a lot of those. Because I know we're going to get some questions like, oh, well, what about barometric pressure, or what about the humidity specifically? And it's like, well, these are kind of clumped in here.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And so every single day, what's really cool, and we're typically doing this, what's called a retrospective analysis. So the data have been collected, and so now we have them. And so, of course, the weather data have also been collected. And so there's one particular researcher or lab or organization that they go through, and I think it's throughout most of the US. But once you give that website a location, they will give you a symbol or number that corresponds to, you're going to fall into one of those 7 categories right there. Based on the weather for your area that day, you're going to be and it's relative to your area, the mean, annual temperature there. You're in a tropical dry day, or you're in a polar dry day, or whatever. So now we have a lot easier way for us to summarize, the effects and the data and the responses.
Yeah. I think it's very good classification of these things. And then I also wanted to define quickly some of the things you guys looked at as far as looking at the bucks, and specifically go towards the top, Jacob. It's at the top. Could you just quickly define like buck movement rates and bedded percentage, kind of what we're looking at here?
Yeah. And so what Natasha did as part of a baseline, and just kind of telling the story here, is that over our study period, so we were looking at from September until I believe the end of February, we're looking at all this, just what on average, how often are bucks moving, when are they on their feet, and when they are moving, what is their movement rate? And so, like we said earlier, we're still comparing all of this data to every individual buck. But if you smoothed all of that over, you took the average of the average, it's going to be about 265 yards per hour when they're on their feet. So then we have the bedded percentage. That is as best we can determine from the way we collected the data, where we can more or less definitively say the buck is bedded. And then we're going to take the amount of time that a buck is classified as bedding, and looking at what proportion of the day during daylight hours is it bedded or not. So that's kind of the way we work through this. Number one, is the buck bedded or not? So it's moving or it's not. When it is moving, how fast is it moving? And so that's the yards per hour.
Yep. That is a very useful way for a hunter to look at it. I really like how you guys did that. I also thought the 34% bedded percentage was very interesting. I feel like the common knowledge would say, this is outside the rut. Common knowledge, like most people would probably predict that number to be higher.
Yes.
Yeah. So
me too.
Yeah. So it goes to show you they are moving somewhat often throughout the day. You just got to be in that right location.
It's funny because it's kind of like humans. It's a third of the day.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And, a lot of that too is there were instances of this to where a buck kind of followed the conventional wisdom, meaning about 9:30 or 2 hours after sunup, it bedded down, and it stayed bedded until 30 minutes before sunset, and it got on its feet. There were instances that happened, but that was very, very rare. There was typically several bedding events throughout the day. So you might have a buck bedded for an hour and a half, then it gets on his feet, goes to a different bed, beds down, browses a little bit along the way. So that was what happened far more commonly than a buck just getting in the bed at morning and staying there until the afternoon.
And that movement between bedding bouts was minimal compared to the kind of, I'm going to get the word wrong, but crepuscular movement. I don't know if that's the right. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Kind of during the just before, just after shooting time periods.
Yeah. And the way I think of it is, it's kind of like your main movement bout for the day, Jacob, is done, meaning you're home from work. But now that you're at home, you might get up and have a snack. You might sit and watch TV or read a book for an hour, and then you might get up and move around and have a snack. That's kind of what we think they're doing. They're getting on their feet and moving around a little bit during the day.
Yeah, I know some hunters use that as a strategy. I think it's common kind of out west with mule deer, for example. I think kind of common knowledge is they tend to have a bed sometime in the morning, but at some point, a lot of people will talk about, as it gets a little later in the day, you get day winds pick up, and then you may get a shifting of the winds, and sometimes that's when bucks will get up, kind of meander around, maybe snack, like you said, and then shift to a second bed. I know even some whitetail hunters that do the same thing. They try and predict that shift to their second bed. So that is very cool to see that you're seeing some of that in the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me make sure I'm focusing on the right graph there. But notice on the right-hand side, percentage of time bedded. Notice there's never 100%.
Mm-hmm.
There's never 90%. There's never 80%. It's almost like at any given time, about half, give or take here, but about half the bucks are on their feet, or they would not be classified as bedding. Now, it does not mean they are exposing themselves and they're in the midst of a movement bout where you would see them, but they're not bedded and they're moving around.
Yeah, and for our listeners, Dr. Strickland, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this graphic is kind of establishing the baseline, correct?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you got it talks about it depicts September and December here, just showing, for the South, right? This will be outside the rut and during the rut, right? December is kind of your guys' rut time frame.
That's right.
But top left depicts that corpuscular movement where you see kind of yards per hour increase around that 6 a.m. time frame. And then again, I'd say that's probably around 7 time frame. So right at dawn and dusk. And then you have percent time bedded, which shows pretty much the same thing, right? The lowest points around 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. And then you see the shift in December where the yards per hour, that line is shifted up because they're moving more. But then you still see those times during the day of, at dawn and dusk, and same as for the percentage time of bedded. So this is what we were referring to earlier as establishing that baseline for different times of the day and different times within the year, right? Because movement rates change.
That's right.
A concise way of saying what you said, Josh, is these graphs show the yards per hour as a function of the hour per day, the hour of the day, both in and out of the rut.
Exactly.
And then also percentage of time bedded as a function of the hour of the day in and out of the rut.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the peaks should be inversely correlated. So when you have a really big peak, that's when the amount of bedded time should go down, and that's exactly what you see.
Scroll down, Jacob. We can get into some of the nitty gritty. So this is an interesting topic here that I kind of want to talk about.
This is huge to me.
Yeah, this was very. Could you go into this graphic here, Bronson, and just kind of discuss it?
Okay, so what we're measuring there, this is when they are moving, yards per hour. And on the left panel there, that is hours since sunrise or hours after sunrise. And what we see there is that they have the greatest yards per hour or rate of movement is about 2 hours after sunrise. So if sunrise was at 7, you'd see the greatest movement rate at about 9 a.m. And it kind of defies some hunter conventional wisdom.
Yep.
I would go into it thinking that probably during dusk, as the sun is coming up and you got the gray woods, that's typically when you see a lot of activity. But keep in mind here, the y-axis there is not deer activity. The y-axis is yards per hour, so the amount of ground they are covering. This is just a hypothesis, just trying to explain the data. But what we think is going on there is yards per hour is probably spiking right there. It's because that is when the bucks are no longer foraging around and they have now made up their mind, my rumen is full, I'm going to bed. And so on a per hour basis, they're covering more ground during that hour or 30 minutes before they go down for their first bed of the morning.
Yeah. So it's showing basically at 2 hours after they're moving at the fastest pace they will during the day. And then I also wanted to point out, so this is both since sunrise. So this is the time before sunrise at legal shooting time. And then it covers until 4 hours after legal shooting time is opened. And then the next graph we have to the right is 4 hours before legal shooting time is closed, all the way till 2 hours after legal shooting time is closed. So we have a pretty good representation of the entire day by these two graphs, and basically the rate of deer movement throughout the day in relation to the shooting time. And looking at all this, there's not a single point on this graph that the average deer is moving less than 200 yards per hour. So again, that's the average rate of movement across all deer. So there may be some deer that are not moving at all. There may be some deer that are moving 8 times the average, but this is the average of all of the deer in this study. And I thought it was really interesting to point out that 2 hours after sunrise is the quickest movement, but it never dips below for the average buck, and the average buck in this study being 3 years old or older. It never dips below 200 yards per hour. And I also wanted to point out that in the sunset graph, the peak movement leaving bed is the traditional wisdom, and going to food occurs at the quickest movement after sunrise. So about an hour after is their peak movement speed, which I assume is probably happening a little bit after they've left their bed. They're probably being cautious as they're leaving their bed. And then their peak movement speed would be the distance between that secure zone and their food. So they are basically on their peak way to the food an hour after sunrise. So they might be moving up from their bed at shooting close, but it's showing a steep correlation between greater movement in the morning and lesser movement in the evening.
Yep.
Now, go ahead, Josh.
I was just clarifying. Jacob had said an hour after sunrise there. I'm just for the listeners. It's sunset there. You meant,
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sunset. Okay. Go ahead, Bronson.
Now, a hypothesis of Steve Damaris's that cannot be discounted is, and the times line up here pretty good. So everything I just said about deer making that, a buck making that last more linear movement before it goes and beds down, Steve's interpretation is, yeah, and that's also 2 hours after sunrise. That means people are starting to get out of their stand and they're bumping them.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see right there at sunset, that's somebody has stayed in the stand maybe for 30 minutes after dark and they're climbing down or getting down or whatever, and they're bumping deer. And so you're getting these more accelerated movements as a response to hunters bumping them. So that is certainly possible as well.
Yeah. I hate to, I never want to refute his point because I highly respect his opinion. But the average amount of sits that we bump deer, I guess knowingly, we obviously bump deer without knowing it. But the average amount of sits, and I guess I'm not one to get down only 2 hours after sunrise or legal shooting time, because I enjoy the woods more than that. But I would say that we're probably, for me, not bumping deer on the majority of my hunts. Now, I may be more careful than the average hunter, but that for that data to express that strong of a correlation across all of the deer of this study would mean that there's a very high frequency in which they're getting bumped by hunters. And I do not know if that is true or if that's not. Another thing I forgot to point out is that it seems about 5 hours before legal shooting ends, there's also a small asymptote there. There's a small uptick in the yards per hour where deer are moving. If we say around 225 yards per hour is our lowest rate, they're moving around 300 yards per hour. which in contrast is just a bit less than even our greatest point. So I feel like it's very interesting that we're seeing sometime around midday a fairly quick rate of movement. And I would highly doubt that that is due to hunter movement, especially being that hunters either out of the woods or not yet getting in the woods by around, as if we say midday is 12 p.m., which looks like this, it very well could be around that time frame, or 1 p.m. I would say that it's very hard for hunters to be bumping deer, causing that influence. I think that would be more in relation to a deer's natural tendency to move, which I thought was really, really interesting by seeing this graph, and not many people notice that.
Well, here's a counterpoint, Jacob, is you're not normal.
That's true. I hear that every day.
So what we're seeing there in the data, being a little bit facetious here, but so we're seeing the bump 2 hours after sunup. That's normal hunters leaving. You know, I got skunked. I sat here for 2 hours, and see there at midday, that's when we're seeing people like you, Jacob. That's when you're getting out of the sand and you're bumping them at midday.
I got you.
So I seriously, I don't discount anything you're saying, but I will add one thing. One thing to keep in mind is notice that when you're looking on that right panel about that greatest movement 1 hour after sunset, keep in mind what we spoke about earlier about food plot visitation and how that changed throughout the year. And so we do assume that. I would really love to have that graph on the right panel just during bow season. I wonder if that would hold versus spreading it out throughout the entire year and getting the influence of 3 months of hunters being on food plots and bumping deer and maybe causing them to move later in the day.
Yeah. And I think we referred to that actually just before we hit record too, as well, because I pointed out a correlation. What arose that conversation earlier was I was looking at some MSU Deer Lab videos and saw that some of their highest viewed videos were in relation to food plots and other things like that. Like their cool season food plots video did pretty dang well. And the buck food plot use during hunting season video did well. And some stuff I might be interested in, like bedding and stuff like that, and antler size prediction and nutrient requirements and stuff like that I would be more interested in, did not perform as well, meaning that the hunters, despite the data that they're being shown that hunters are favoring food plots and that's having a negative effect on deer movement, meaning that linearly deer are visiting food plots at later hours as the season progresses. Despite that data being in front of them, they still want to know more about food plots and are very likely pressuring and hunting food plots more. So yeah, that again, cool that we're seeing this data. This is how good data works, right? You know, you see the results of that pop up in multiple places.
Yeah.
I wanted to hit on something that you said, Bronson, with these graphs here kind of defying some conventional wisdom from hunters. Whereas the graph on the left, you know, it's depicting bucks are most active 2 hours after legal shooting begins, and the one on the right depicting, you know, bucks are most active 1 hour after legal shooting ends. I would say a lot of hunters would, if they had a choice to hunt mornings or evenings, I think most would pick evenings. Can you go up a little bit back where you were?
I'm already anticipating some of this.
Sorry. I would say most individuals would pick the evening time to hunt here. Myself, I love to hunt mornings. I'd rather track a deer in the daylight than in the dark, right? And if I feel like I can get in cleanly in an area, I will hunt a morning any time of the year. Early season, you know, whenever. I typically prefer mornings. But with that, I think predicting movement as far as like where a deer is much tougher in the morning, which I think is depicted here. So the yards per hour is, highest. I know it's fairly high. Maybe when someone's, going into their stand, let's say they're accessing. So I think trying to predict as far as where that deer is difficult. And then if you look in the evening, right, that movement rate, 2 hours before legal shooting ends, it's lower compared to the highest movement rate, right? So implying there that, that it's maybe a little easier to predict that buck might be bedded down, and you have a better idea of where he's at, thus, knowing where you need to access and how you need to access, right? I think there's just more room for error going hunting in the mornings, and you have to be very careful because those movement rates can be higher.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And the way I think about it and explain it is, and these are averages, like we talked about earlier, there's never any zeros in this data, and there's never any 100%. It's just tendencies that, at any given time, there are some deer moving. But the bottom line is the data are very clear, and it makes intuitive sense. When you hunt the morning, you are going in during a feeding/movement bout. The deer, a greater proportion of the deer are on their feet moving and less predictable. Whereas when you go into the woods at, say, 1 p.m. in the afternoon, a greater proportion of bucks are bedded. All of them aren't bedded, but a greater proportion of them are. And so strategically, you probably have better odds of getting into your stand undetected than you do in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to point out, with hunting pressure comes variability. There's a few other things I'm seeing as I look at these graphs a little bit longer. If we're assuming that the uptick in deer movement is due to hunter pressure 2 hours after shooting begins, we also see the lowest point in movement of all of our data occurring 2 hours before legal shooting ends, which might be the time, if hunters are leaving 2 hours after, they may be arriving 2 hours before, and those deer may be more likely to sit tight. Now, it is interesting that the factor of difference but at this 2 hours before is much smaller than this 2 hours after. But where you can see that hunters and other things have influence more so than maybe some other factors is that if you look at this data before shooting begins, aka the time that there has not been pressure in the woods for a very long amount of time, it is the most consistent data that there is. You can see we've got 5 different hour markers, bam, 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 all at a very, very linear rate, staying completely equal at around 275 yards per hour of movement. So when there isn't volatility in the data, there's likely not outside factors influencing it as much. So when we're looking here at all of our daylight movement, it all has greater variation. There's ups, downs, there's greater changes, even when it's decreasing or increasing. When those hunters have influence over the deer, the data are reflecting it, whether it's the way we think or not. You can see it in the variation of the data. I also think it's interesting, Josh, we talk about this a lot, especially in warmer climates. Another thing we didn't point out when we're trying to associate why this might be is that, especially when it's warmer out, it has been cool all night long. The deer are the most comfortable that they will ever be on a warm day when it has been nighttime and it has been cool for a very long period of time. So it makes sense that they're most fit to move at a faster rate after the nighttime. Obviously, if we're looking at a deer season, September to December, it's most likely that the smallest portion of the season they are affected by harmfully cold weather than they are harmfully warm weather. So we can see that warm weather having a big influence on them. And then the necessity to survive maybe taking influence when it comes to the end of that day, whether it be rut or food. We could see a greater uptick, but not necessarily in shooting hours. So they're waiting for that temperature to get cooler, and they're waiting for those factors that influence them in the morning to come by yet again, which occurs after shooting hours, as we're seeing here.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and scroll down, Jacob.
This bedded percentage is essentially showing that same thing.
Yep.
That, it's the inverse of their movement.
Yep. So we can move on.
The last thing I wanted to point out too, sorry, Josh, I'm totally beating a dead horse here, but we talked about this very well in our last episode, is linear movement versus tortuous movement. It should be pointed out that this data, I assume, and I'm pretty confident in this, that we're looking at data that is total movement, maybe not linear movement. So 200 yards per hour doesn't mean they're getting 200 yards in an hour from their bed. It means that they may be winding in circles and going 10 yards from their bed or 20 yards from their bed, most likely somewhere a little bit more than that. But just know that the amount they're moving isn't always the same as the distance they're moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we covered that in the previous episode with y'all.
Yep.
With the total distance moved versus net displacement.
Yep.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Josh, you want to touch on this? I'm betting.
Yeah. So the for the listeners here, if you're not watching on YouTube, right, we've moved on to the slide where it talks about daytime activity by rut phase. So Bronson, correct me if I'm wrong here. This is just looking at the movement rates and different phases of the rut and depicting how, in general, the rut's effect on movement. Correct?
That is 100% correct, and we have more rut phases defined here than normally.
Yeah.
Most people just have pre-rut, peak rut, post-rut, but we wanted to break them apart into 2-week intervals, so we have the exact same number of days. So we began with a 2-week interval of the peak of the rut, and then 2 weeks after and 2 weeks before, and then another 2 weeks, another 2 weeks. So that's how we end up with 5 different phases of pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, late rut, post-rut. So that is what you're seeing. And then Natasha has no rut, so outside the rut, the breeding season altogether. And what is most compelling with these data to me from a hunting perspective is there absolutely is, the metric is yards per hour, so movement rate, and it's depicted with that green line. So we see the greatest movement rate during the peak of the rut, and that should be no surprise to anybody whatsoever. But notice the difference between the peak of the rut and, say, the late rut or the early rut, meaning we've got a 6-week period there. 6-week period where the peak of the rut is a little bit better, but we're only talking about 30, 40 yards per hour difference. And so if you're looking at that graph, there are 3 lines that are distinctly different and greater than the other 3 lines. Mm-hmm. And that is the early rut, the peak of the rut, and late rut for 6 weeks.
Yep. That goes back to, I believe, a point you said earlier, right, where nothing overseeds the rut, right, as far as the movement goes. And then this also shows bedded percentage here, which correlates. They're moving more, therefore they are bedded less, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And just for our listeners, so hunters can put this in reference. When we say no rut, let's use the Midwest for example. No rut meaning if you're like Kentucky starts first Saturday of September. So no rut would be that September into early October time frame, correct? If they have that more traditional Midwest rut. And then as far as pre-rut, how do you guys define that? Is that more like your late October time frame?
So in this, with these data here, the pre-rut would be, so let's back up 2 weeks prior to the peak of the rut would be the early rut. Mm-hmm. And then we got to back up another 2 weeks. So that would essentially be 1 month before the peak of the rut.
Okay.
Is what we're calling pre-rut.
Okay. So for
the Midwest, peak breeding around me at least, November 7th to 9th. So we'd be looking at October 7th to 9th for the pre-rut.
Right.
And the early rut would be 14 days after that, and the peak rut would be 14 days after that.
Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
I just wanted to define that for the listeners, just so they have an idea of when we look at the temperature effects and like pre-rut and early rut specifically.
It ought to scream to you as well. There are never any certainties.
Yeah.
With buck movement. And, we talk about, oh my gosh, the peak of the rut, and rightfully so. It's all about probability and odds, and peak of the rut's going to be the greatest opportunity for a buck to be on his feet and to see it. But we go from an extreme of the bedding percentage during the day is 21%, and we go all the way to outside of the rut, 37%. So deer are behaving the same. It's just that during the rut, they're a little bit more active.
Yeah. We don't have to talk about this because this would open up a big rabbit hole. I just wanted to mention this to you, Bronson, and we can discuss it after this podcast. This is a topic I wanted to talk with Luke about in a different episode. But as far as like looking at it from like a probability standpoint, right? If you're looking at the peak rut numbers and they are moving more, right? You would think that, the likelihood of you getting on a buck, right, it would be greater. But I want to challenge that viewpoint with Luke, specifically for those people that are very successful in early season, and why I think that might be. Because I think it's much easier to predict movement, or at least get on a buck in a certain area if he's moving less. Once his movement rates increase, it's a lot harder to try and figure out where he's at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was, and forgive me if the episodes may be running together, but like we alluded to a moment ago, the whole total distance, net displacement, daily home range is that I completely agree, Josh, with what you're saying. Home range is going to be smaller during the pre-rut. There is going to be more of a pattern. The downside of during the peak of the rut is that there's more randomness.
Yeah.
There is a doe coming into estrus and he's gone, and the net displacement from day to day is those daily areas that they cover, which is remarkably similar. It's 200 acres per day. But from day to day, the distance between those areas is further apart during the rut. So that makes it, like you're alluding to, it's harder to get on a buck that time of year because he may be a mile away. He is moving more and he's bedded less. That's true. But a specific buck trying to get on him, the way I think about increasing odds during the peak of the rut is just time on stand.
Yeah. Getting into a location where you feel like it's your highest odds of at some point he's going to come through here.
That's right.
Because of these factors, and then putting time on stand. We'll deep dive into all that stuff in a different episode, or it'll probably come out before this episode. So I apologize to the listeners because we're recording at different times. Okay, Jacob, you're moving here to a different graph.
Do you want to do daily temperature versus afternoon movement?
Go back up.
This is covered in the beginning.
So we covered. Go down. Sorry. So right here, because that depicts daily movement rate in yards per hour, and it looks at the tropical dry, tropical moist. So let's go ahead and look at this graphic here. I think it paints a pretty good picture. So Bronson, what did you guys generally see here when you're looking at the weather types and the effects of the tropical and polar, dry versus moist in different times of the year?
Well, the statistical explanation would be that there is a statistical relationship with the polar fronts, meaning that we more often than not are seeing the signal of a little bit greater movement when we have those polar fronts, that type of weather that's related to cool temperature, broadly temperature, and then also whether it be dry or whether it be moist, the signal was pretty consistent. It's just that it's cooler temperatures. But the other way of looking at it too is I gave you statistically, but there's never certainty with that, meaning there's always exceptions.
Yeah.
And so what you see here is pretty good evidence, pretty, strong evidence that within every one of those rut categories, outside the rut, pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, late rut, post-rut, we will typically see more often than not the greatest movement rate within that rut category is related to cool weather.
Yep.
So to me, that shows a whole bunch right there. It tells a story. The power of the rut, number one, supersedes everything, the power of the rut, and then a tendency to have a little bit more on those cold fronts.
It seems interesting to me that just glancing over this, quite often in the at least early rut and forward, so that would be outside of the rut, pre-rut, and early rut, cool weather associated with moist or precipitation is showing higher movement than if it was cool weather without precipitation or moisture. And then it flips when it comes to the peak rut, late rut, and post rut. They actually move less, it seems. While it's not a gigantic difference, it does seem that they move less, albeit 25 yards per hour around that function, or around that much. Yeah, I just find it interesting that before it gets really cold out, they're moving more with precipitation. And once it does get a little bit colder out, even though it's during the rut, they're moving a little bit less. And that's consistent.
And Jacob, what I wonder there, I forget if Natasha covered this in the weather podcast you referred to earlier, but I think we did. I think Luke even talked about scenting with a dog,
Mm-hmm.
but the humidity effect. So when we're talking about grouping these things together in these fronts, typically with rain on the front end, during it, and afterwards, greater humidity. And so when Natasha was isolating these individual little weather types, events, phenomenon, there was a relationship at some point with humidity. And meaning when you had a greater humidity, you would see for a period of time, it was a threshold effect, but there was a period within that relationship where you saw a movement response to humidity.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because in the early rut, what most hunters would call the pre-rut, let's say, when there's rut activity going on, but if you were less specific about it than this graph is being, it's the conventional wisdom pre-rut. So you're thinking mid-October in the Midwest, mid to late October in the Midwest. Well, actually, probably around the 20th and onward in the Midwest. There is a huge difference between dry weather and moist weather when it comes to deer movement. And conventional wisdom is as the study defines it, early rut, or as many people say, pre-rut, that 2 weeks before peak breeding activity, when bucks are looking for does, they're using their noses a lot. They're moving in such a way that they're having a scent advantage, whether that be downwind of doe bedding and stuff like that. They're trying to find does, and they're using their noses to do so. And so they're moving quite a large amount more. I'm looking at a graph, and it's showing, just for instance, in that 2 weeks before rut time period, they may be moving, when it's dry out and tropical, they could be moving either 200 yards per hour in dry. And when it's moist, it's almost 300 yards per hour. So they're moving at a rate of almost 100 more yards per hour, given however much precipitation there is or how moist the air is. And then there's the same increase we can see. It's maybe around the factor 40 to 50 yards per hour when it is cold as well, when it's polar, dry versus moist. But in both cases, we're seeing far greater movement when there's moisture and or precipitation.
And what could be going on there, Jacob, is let's replace the x-axis with take away the rut categories and add month.
Yeah.
And what you could have going on there as well is moisture may be more limited. In other words, our October in the South and Mississippi is typically our driest month. And so you might start where we're calling the peak rut there, and we start to see less of an effect of the moisture. It might be that threshold in wintertime to where we have more rain events. and humidity's just up because of that.
That's a very good point.
And these plots show the variation and where the average falls. So your icons are where the average falls. It's daily movement in yards per hour as a function of your weather type and broken down by phase of the season. So in the rut phases, the early rut, which 2 weeks before peak rut, and then the peak rut phases, and then a little bit in the late rut, we're seeing the greatest volatility or variation in the data as well. So that adds a little bit of homage to how much the movement can vary on any given day during the rut in any particular area with any certain amount of deer. So yeah, that rut is volatile but predictable in a way, because we can predict that they're going to move more, but the factor with which they do move more changes quite a bit day to day.
I wanted to make a point on the pre-rut here. So for folks in the Midwest, this would be kind of like that early October timeframe, because I hear this quite often every year, and it is something that I look for specifically when I'm hunting in October, is those early October cold fronts. I feel like that is a great time to get on a buck you are targeting. And in the data here, we can see if you're looking at the daily movement rate, right? So from the within the phase, we're just going to use pre-rut. So at the lowest movement rate would be the tropical moist. And we compare that to the highest movement rate there, which would be your polar moist. Right, there's almost 100 yard per hour difference there. Yeah. And that movement rate is, heck, it's almost equal to some of the movement rates you see in the early rut and late rut. Or that's a pretty significant jump there. And I think some of the data that we'll get into depicts that as well. Yeah. But I found that very interesting, and it just reminded me of those early October cold fronts that a lot of people tend to talk about and use that as a tactic.
So our data here certainly support that. And you think about that time of year here in the South, it's still pretty hot. And, in terms of a deer physiologically, that the heat very well may be suppressing the amount they move and when they start, because they got to cool their body. And so, you get that first cool front, whether it's accompanied by rain or not, but you have that first good cold front come in, and I kind of think the deer find it liberating.
Yeah.
It's not going to be such a challenge to keep cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And to point to, people in the Midwest, this certainly applies to us as well. Again, proportionate to what we're experiencing. Those deer in their environment in the South are adapted to the temperatures that they face in the South. And just like our deer are here, that there may be a threshold where all deer are severely suffering, but I assume that the post-rut 20-degree days for you guys are like the post-rut -10 to single-digit days for us here. Those deer have their average temperature ranges that they operate within, and these are good conclusions for all areas. And to avoid hunter-splaining this data, when we have the man here that is an expert at breaking it down, I really wanted to draw like really stark conclusions and maybe a recommendation for a hunter based on this, especially for those that can't see that data right now. So for instance, for an example of what I would like you to do here, Dr. Strickland, is based on this data in the peak rut, the data suggests that you are better off hunting polar conditions than you are tropical conditions, so colder conditions than you are warm conditions, and you're better off hunting in a drier condition than a moist condition when it's cold out in the peak rut, but it does not have an extremely significant factor like we just talked about. So could you break down season by season maybe what the ideal scenario is and the factor that the weather has, maybe the dryness or the cold or warmth, if that's a giant factor for that particular time of year or not?
This may be too generic compared to what you wanted. This may not have quite the insight you were looking for, but this is the way I read the data, is that if I looking at this graph, and now we're going to say, what gives me the best odds of encountering a buck? It may not be my target buck, the one I'm going, but the greatest opportunity to go hunt and see a buck, it would be relatively cool temperatures. So typically a front coming out of the north, whether it be with rainfall or without, during the peak of the rut. However, any time during the peak of the rut is better. So the worst time during the peak of the rut is better than the best time in the pre-rut or the post-rut. So here with our rut in this study area, if you just look at early rut, the 2 weeks prior to peak, and then peak, you got about a month there of where deer activity is significantly greater than other times of the year. And add in the late rut as well. So the way I look at that is, if I have a 2-week period, 3-week period to where, okay, it's the rut. Now I'm going to start looking at weather. And if I could only pick 1 day to go or 2 days to go, and I have the flexibility in my schedule, it's go during the rut and it's go during those cold fronts. And then it's just like going to a casino. I don't, but if you did, what's going to give you the best odds, and those are the best odds to win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tying into some other research then is now it's not so much about when I'm hunting relative to weather, but where I'm hunting. I also start looking at the post-rut, and now I start thinking about post-rut body recovery, and that's where I'm really going to focus on food. So on a previous episode, we started looking at visitation to food plots, and bucks, I'm rounding a little bit here, but bucks visited food plots during the rut as commonly as any other time of the year. So when you look at the frequency of their visits during the rut, it was just as frequent as any other time. But what was different was that the duration of stay on the food plot was the shortest. So y'all can piece together what's going on there. A buck is going to a food plot during the peak of the rut. He's not going there to eat.
Mhm.
He's going there to look for does. He's going there to scent check, taking a look out, who's there, nobody's there, no doe in heat, I'm moving on. So he's maybe there 5-10 minutes. When we got to the post-rut, bucks were visiting those plots as frequently, but they were staying there and foraging. So I think towards the end of deer season, relative to when your rut is and when the end of your deer season is, but during the post-rut, that is a great time of the year to focus on food.
I agree with that. Jacob, do you want to scroll down here? Because I believe there we get into some more data down here that also kind of depicts what we were just looking at. Sorry, go up a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry, I just like that graph.
Yeah, we'll get there. So this one, the graph is depicting the daily high temperature effects as far as like afternoon movement. So this is just a good visual here. It gives movement rates in relation to like a temperature range, and also gives like bedded percentage. So we can see here, right, those cooler temps at 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The movement rate is 314 yards per hour. Bedded percentage is 35%. And then as you get higher temps of 55 to 70 degrees, that movement rate drops to 247 yards per hour. Bedding percentage increases, and then so on and so forth as you get hotter and hotter. This goes all the way to 85 to 100 degrees. So bucks are moving less, 170 yards per hour, and they are bedded more 45% of the time.
Yeah,
I think that's a good visual.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too to see that the bedded percentage for 85 to 100% to 100 degrees is lower. Is lower than the next bracket, which is 70 to 85 degrees. But the movement yards per hour is also lower. Typically what we're seeing in this data is that as your bedded time decreases, your rate of movement increases. And so this is the one step in the data from hot to very hot that we're seeing that bedding times still decrease, but also the yards per hour decrease. So normally what we'd expect is if they're bedded for a shorter amount of time, that they're moving a longer amount of time. But we're seeing the reverse by a minor factor from the case of hot to extremely hot. I wanted to also point out that every other piece of data we've looked at that is in regards to rut phase with movement and other things like that, you would think sometimes during the rut phase, during peak rut, there's so much movement. They're running, they're chasing, stuff like that, that there may be a time that they have a relatively similar percentage of time bedded, but they're moving far greater because they're running at times. But that's not always what the data is showing. It's typically not what it's showing. We're seeing that the amount of time bedded is kind of king in determining how much movement they're going to do. There's a very, very strong correlation between the two. I was even crunching some numbers on the rut kind of breakdown that we were looking at earlier that we're going to touch on a little more later in another episode. And the percentages of change for both the factors of bedding percentage and yards per hour were very, very similar. Even between our greatest changes time of year where there's no rut to peak rut, we're seeing a very similar thing with temperature.
And I will add in one caveat. That's a good observation, Jacob, about the bedding percentage when you go to the 70 to 85 category to the 85 to 100. Keep in mind there with the 85 to 100, far less reps, far less number of days right there. So there could be a little bit more rounding error, so to speak, with that. So the number may not be quite as reliable. When you get to the 70 and then the 55 to 70 and the 32, that's where we're going to have the most observations and the most reliable data.
So maybe even more advantageous for a hunter would be movement bouts. So the amount of times that the deer moved, I think that might have a pretty good correlation with success as a hunter, especially if you're dialed in on where they're bedding or like to bed or like to hang out during the day, than even linear movement or total distance traveled. Did you see, and I know you're going to have to think of this offhand, did you see any correlation between temperature and the amount of times they moved? Because, let's theorize on a hot day, they might have to move to water, move to food many, many times. Although they're not traveling as far, they're making more movements than maybe on a cooler day. Now that is all completely conjecture there, but did you see anything like that where some amount of weather begetted more movement bouts?
I'm having to think back. I don't think we looked at that relative to weather, but I know Natasha did do that, but I think it was relative to rut phases that she did that. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of variability, even with a buck from day to day, how many beds they have. But I do not have those numbers in front of me.
Yeah, that's just fine. Now I'm interested in that too. I feel like we could have a giant nerd out session with Natasha on all sorts of stuff.
You can.
Jacob, you were excited about this graphic here.
I know everyone likes to see a line between their data, but I think it's really cool seeing these points and kind of showing that, like, pretty much no matter what we're looking at in the evening, that the temperature has a more predictable influence on the movement in the evening movement than it does in morning movement. So the morning movement, I believe every single data point for morning movement is consistently higher. So they're going to be moving faster in the morning, period, end of story, all things the same as the evening is kind of what I'm interpreting from this. So if those that aren't seeing this visually, which we hope you go look at our or MSU Deer Lab University's YouTube channels for this, but these two graphs are showing the yards per hour, the average yards per hour, as a factor of rut phase, temperature, and morning versus evening. So what rut phase are we in? What temperature is it during that phase? And how does that influence how far they're moving? And then it breaks that down by morning and evening. So it's really, really beneficial to see all of this. But what I'm seeing here is that in the morning, regardless of rut phase and regardless of temperature, they're moving more every single time. And then in the evening, I'm seeing that the data looks a little bit more predictable, that it appears almost every time we're getting colder temperatures, or every time we're getting colder temperatures in this case, there's greater movement in the evening than if we had warmer temperatures, which to me means that that kind of makes me question, are they waiting longer to get out of bed and just kicking out quickly because they have to move? Our data earlier doesn't necessarily support that theory. But kind of what conclusions are you gathering from that?
I guess the biggest conclusion I had was I don't know why, but I like that it was remarkably consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And so we look in the left hand panel there for morning, and one thing you'll notice is that you have some different colored dots in the morning, and that is because those really dark blue, that's the 20 to 32 degrees. And down here, you're only going to see that right around sunup and after. You're not going to see that in the afternoon. But what is so consistent is that in the afternoon, we are seeing greater movement rate. And you'll notice all of those blue dots we always have in every single phase of the rut. On the cooler days, that is where they have a greater movement rate in terms of yards per hour.
And in some cases, it's really significant.
Yeah. And what I love about that is, to me, I don't have to put together a story of, on these days it does this, and on these days it does that, and try to reconcile it. When oftentimes when the data are mismatched, it's just random, and we fail to admit that it's just random. We try to make a pattern, but this is a pattern in the afternoon. It's remarkably consistent.
Some might say there is a clear signal.
There is a very clear signal. Yeah.
Yeah, that was...
Get you, Josh, picking up on stuff as we do these episodes.
I think this is one of my favorite graphics here that you guys put together. Just because, like you said, it is so clearly kind of defined there in the evenings when you have those colder temperatures, right? It results in those greater movement rates. And that's seen throughout each phase that's depicted here, outside the rut all the way to post-rut. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think that the cooler temperatures in this environment, it just stimulates movement, that they will be in their thermoneutral zone, meaning they're not having to expend energy to stay warm or stay cool. They're in their thermoneutral zone, so there's not any suppression or limitation because of the environment. And so maybe now they're just responding totally to their stomach or to the rut.
Mm-hmm.
And temperature isn't really playing a role.
Yeah. I also really like this because, as I stated earlier, I like to hunt mornings, and this somewhat, kind of clearly shows if you're comparing each phase to each other. So like outside the rut, for example, if you're comparing morning to evening, and this goes for any phase, the morning movement rate is still higher than the evening. And this, I don't know, it kind of affirms to myself, I like mornings early season, which most people don't. I like it for a few reasons. One, because of what I just said, most people don't like to hunt that time, so there's less pressure in the woods. But then two, it is the coolest, especially early season, it's the coolest temperature during the day. So I feel like that movement rate is a little higher, and that is shown here. So I like this.
Yeah.
That's my own bias here.
No, well, you're exactly right. And for you being a morning hunter, those are the greatest odds.
Mm-hmm.
It does not matter. The weather does not matter as much in the morning.
Yep.
The weather is having a bigger impact in the afternoon.
Yep. Any other points you wanted to make on this graphic here, Jacob.
So if I'm not used to looking at data and I'm a hunter, I might see more volatility here. I might see that this looks less visually pleasing in the morning side. And I might be like, wow, I can pattern a deer less in the morning and therefore have less of a chance at killing it in the morning than the evening. And that's wrong. So to kind of add a little bit of quantification to this, it looks like I'm trying to add this up here, but on the morning side, we have 1, 2, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We have 13 data points out of, I believe it's 18. 13 out of 18, I think. Josh, you can double check me there. That correlate with more than 300 yards per hour of movement. So at the vast majority of if you took any time of year in any weather in the morning, that you could predict that they're going to be moving more than 300 yards per hour on average. And if you look at the evening side of things, the vast majority of the data are showing that they're going to be moving 300 yards per hour or less, regardless of time of year and regardless of temperature. So we can see that if you were to make things really simple, pick a random morning with a random temperature, and they're very likely going to be moving more than that same random morning with random temperature. We can see across the board that that's true, regardless, but your chances in the morning of catching movement are far greater. Now, we talked about hunters and how the hunters may have an impact on deer movement. I would say throughout the year, the average hunter is probably working in the morning and trying to hunt in the evening. I know that's me. I know that's Josh. I know that's most of the people that we talk to. So I assume there's more hunter effort in the evening, which may correlate to less deer movement. And then if we go back up to our graph, I think it's this one here, we're seeing that a lesser factor due to hunting pressure in the morning, if we're associating this with hunting pressure, than we are seeing in the evening. We're seeing that they're having a greater yards per hour difference away from hunting in the evening when most likely most people are hunting. So this would also support our theories that these are somewhat related to hunter movement as well.
Could be.
It's nice to see, like, even if we're trying to put logic behind it, we're seeing similar influences. We're seeing similar results in the data across whatever we're analyzing as well.
Yep. And this goes back to an earlier point here where I talked about the greatest difference in movement rate in the specific phase. So like that early October time frame for us in the Midwest here on this would probably be depicted as the pre-rut time frame. If you look at the difference in movement rates from kind of the lowest temperature to highest temperature, right? There is a greater difference compared to the other phases, right? So that kind of speaks to me of, those cold fronts, early October cold fronts again. I feel like it is depicted there as well.
Close to 100.
Josh, I was going to say the exact same thing. Earlier when you brought that point up, it was with the types of front.
Yeah.
And whether it be polar or not. And now you're just looking at temperature, and that is where you see the greatest range of difference is during the pre-rut period of, what is that? You've got 55 degrees or so, but you see you're about 250 yards per hour.
Well, that's a big difference.
It didn't double, but we're getting close to doubling there when you have the cold front come in during the pre-rut. That is where we see the greatest range of difference. So the greatest stimulating response of temperature is during the pre-rut.
Yeah, it's funny because It's funny because we call that, a month before rut, early October, we call that the lull even around here. And you can see that during that quote unquote lull, which we've disproved many times, but you see during the period that the people refer to as the lull, for us in Wisconsin. The very, very end of September, maybe, but definitely the early portions of October. It's more important for you to select your weather wisely, and that weather ideally being colder weather. If you are trying to make a strategic strike on a buck and catch him doing more movement than he might normally do, the averages and the data across many deer in many areas support that selecting for a cold front to make your strike, if you have to, would be ideal. And at times, a cold front in the October lull, you can have as good a movement as the average day in the peak rut, very close to the same movement, which is really interesting. So, I mean, if you're looking at this data here, as you see these dots get closer vertically, the less important it is for you to select your temperature. And as you see the dots expand vertically, the more important it is for you to select your temperature if you're trying to make one strategic strike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It just blows my mind when you look at the morning pre-rut phase. That coldest temperature, that movement rate is almost equivalent to in the evening during the peak rut coldest temperature. Like, it's very close.
Yeah. Yeah, that is remarkable, actually. Like, cold temperatures during the pre-rut can be as good a movement. A morning pre-rut in the cold can be as good as an afternoon in the peak rut in the cold. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Let's scroll down. I think we've covered the majority of it here.
Collar temperature.
Yeah, we don't necessarily.
Humidity is something I wanted to touch on. Humidity and wind speed, I think, are really important.
Yeah, we touched on humidity a little bit, but yeah, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, we can see that besides zero humidity, which I assume we talked about error with how many days that occurs with. I assume that you guys aren't getting zero humidity quite a bit in the south.
Very rare.
Yeah, so at a more realistic point of humidity, 18%, 20%, somewhere around there. The change in yards per hour, and again, this isn't the yards per hour, but the change in yards per hour. So how much their acceleration to their velocity, velocity being yards per hour, change in yards per hour being acceleration. So how much they are changing, how much they're moving, if that makes sense, is increasing over time as humidity increases. It might also follow that their yards per hour is increasing as humidity increases. So again, we talked about using scent in more humid temperatures with more precipitation. They're going to move more from this data, and correct me if I'm wrong here, when it's more humid.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. One way to look at it too might be that there's a baseline humidity, and where we probably see the most profound effect is going to be when it's really, really dry. So I mean, when humidity is less than 20%, that's really, really dry. But let's keep that in mind. So that is, relatively speaking, that is the greatest effect we see. But now let's put it in realistic terms. We're only seeing a deviation or a suppression of movement of only 25 yards per hour. Mm-hmm. So when we go back to the very beginning with our baseline is 265 yards per hour, and then during the rut, we're getting 400 yards per hour. So now this humidity effect is suppressing it by 25 yards per hour. So the power of large numbers, we detected a difference. Is that really meaningful compared to the data we were just talking about with temperature? I'll let you decide about that, but I don't think it's near as compelling.
Yeah, and I should note that the max deviation, if we took the absolute, besides zero, worst case scenario for humidity versus the best case scenario for humidity, that change in yards per hour is around a factor of 40, 40 delta yards per hour. So that while 40 yards per hour, 40 yards in the hour that you're targeting that deer might seem significant to hunters, keep in mind also that you're likely not getting an 18% humidity day back to back with a 90% humidity day. So this is probably more a result of time of year, more so than it is humidity, and it's being expressed in humidity as a result of time per year, kind of in the background. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add in, and y'all know this, people that work with data, you just have to be very careful on the rare events, not reading too much into the rare events.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have for like the past 3 years, we've only had a weekend, typically in January, but for us, where it gets really, really, really cold. So we're getting down to 15 degrees or 10 degrees, and it'll only last for about 2 days. But I don't want to draw conclusions about deer behavior of just what they did on those 2 days. So I guess, Jacob, the only thing I would say is pretty clear relationship with the graph, but just keep in mind the sub 20% humidity days, few and far between.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
on those
absolutely.
particular days, there could have been other stuff going on too to cause that.
Yeah, agreed. The other thing too that I thought this was really interesting, the changes in yards per hour with wind speed going from 0 to 20 miles per hour. We're not seeing a very significant change in the change in yards per hour. Why did you guys choose to do change in yards per hour in this versus yards per hour?
We wanted to do everything there with just deviation from baseline. Just
Gotcha.
back to that, what is that buck's norm? And then, based on all those averages from those bucks, do we see a deviation from their normal or not?
Gotcha. So this is basically a comparison of the average to what they typically do on days expressed by these conditions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at it kind of, this forms an extraordinarily subtle U shape. It's a couple points higher on either end of 0 mph and your max, which is around 20 something mph. So we're seeing that there's actually a bit of a dip, again, not very significant, around the 10 to 15 mile per hour range, but maybe a little bit more significant, and it's very, very small deviation from normal at 0 and 20 miles per hour wind. So I don't think personally this is something that I'm going to draw conclusions from and center my hunting patterns around, like how I hunt these deer, and anything from 0 to 20. Now, I don't know what the data looks like for 40 miles per hour winds, but I assume it can't look great. And I also assume you guys didn't include this on this graph because that doesn't happen very often.
That's exactly right. We had so few events that the data would be unreliable to draw any conclusions. And Jacob, my take home from the wind is we see, a very uncompelling response there, very little variation. The wind is going to affect me more than it's going to affect the deer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And are you guys...
I don't want to hunt when it's 20 miles per hour and it's really cold.
Yeah. And when you're determining what is representative of what's common, are you guys kind of going Six Sigma with this? Like, are you doing 3 standard deviations for the mean? Like, how are you determining whether something is statistically happening often enough to draw conclusions from?
Well, on some of that, we're probably not even doing a test on it. If it's something where we can see clearly in the data, there's only 3 instances of whatever we're measuring, that's not reliable enough.
And you have thousands of data points, if not tens of thousands, if not more.
Hundreds of thousands.
So hundreds of thousands. So let's do I'll do a quick crunch here. 3 divided by 100,000 is 0.00003. So you've got 0.003% of the time. So that is quite literally 3 standard deviations outside the mean. So that is a very common statistical practice, that if you have something at that little frequency, you eliminate it from your data set. It's not accurately representing your normal curve.
Yep.
Yeah. I get, we probably use different nomenclature, but that's what we do with what we call outlier. When we look for outliers in the data, it'll either be between usually anything that's 3 standard deviations away from the mean.
Yeah.
That we'll scrutinize it to make sure it wasn't a data error.
That's exactly what we're doing in projects at my work right now. So
the funny thing about us hunters is an outlier is maybe a particular buck, and I feel like that's where we gravitate towards or have interest in, like, oh, that buck did this, and instead of looking at the other data, right? Whereas a researcher, you may throw it out, but a general hunter like wants to know all about it. It's just funny how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even say just hunters. I would say humans.
Yeah.
All humans do it.
These other graphs we have here are just different ways in which we're looking at this data, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So
You may gravitate towards this depending on who you are. So I highly suggest you guys either watch this or again watch episode 82 on the MSU Deer Labs YouTube channel. And it's again, this one's hours after sunrise movement, the time that they're getting down to their bed or leaving their bed based on the time of year.
Yep. Rut phase. Relative to rut phase.
Rut phase.
Yeah. And yeah, the very general relationship there is that they are bedding down a little bit later in the morning outside of the rut. And as we get further and further into the rut, surprisingly to me, they're bedding down a little bit earlier, but you gotta put that in context, their first bed.
mhm.
They're not bedded down for the day. It's their first bed. And then we see again the inverse correlation, but they're also leaving their bed earlier.
I think what you pointed out there too, with being their first bed, might dispel some people that are thinking that when we're seeing greater movement in the morning, it's happening from first to second bed. That greater movement in the morning is in fact nighttime movement to first bed. And then this, again, our conventional wisdom would be that this graph is the opposite, right? Like a lot of people say, I don't start hunting mornings until, rut starts kicking in because that's when it gets good. There is a huge difference here. I think that's really interesting that there isn't some gradual sloping down in this. You actually see the opposite. It's increasing and then rapidly decreases. But what we're seeing here, again, more support for hunting in the morning is that early in the season, up until the lull to peak rut, which is around, let's say the pre-rut, what most people would call it, maybe not pre-rut definition by this, but 2 weeks before peak rut, you're much better off hunting the morning than you are the evening. And that changes. It gets actually an inverse relationship. You're much better hunting the evening in the rut phases, the peak rut and onward, which in turn is how most people succeed. The average person, I would say, isn't succeeding in the early season and then is succeeding more often during the rut. And a lot of people write it off to the amount of buck movement when we can see through the data here and in previous discussions we've had, it's more likely that they're selecting the wrong times to hunt. And by the time they have the right times to hunt, it also is, correlating with how the deer like to move.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Yep, that was a very good point. Again, you got to put everything into context of where you're at, time of year, time of day, etc., to help
Also
increase your odds.
The bottom end of the y-axis here in the rut phase is 1.5, where this is 1.2. So really, our other graph starts here, which is also interesting in seeing that if you graphed the no rut and pre-rut phases of leaving bed, so afternoon hunting, it wouldn't even show up on the bottom or on the morning graph. So that's, again, how much stronger of a correlation with movement the morning movement is. Let's go a little bit further here. I think we touched on this one.
Yeah, just looking at the data a little bit differently here in terms of bedding times, as far as like hours bedded after sunrise and when they're leaving their beds in the afternoon. Again, it kind of showed what we just went over, but this is in relation to temperature during the rut phase.
What conclusions are you drawing from this one, Dr. Strickland?
It's very messy.
Yeah.
Difficult to draw conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, if we compare the two graphs, I guess you can see if I was to pick a line where the majority are above or under, I mean, 1.75 hours, so hour 45 minutes after sunrise is around the time that majority of bedding is happening for the morning, regardless of phase. And then if you're looking at hour and 45 minutes when you're doing an evening hunt. So the amount of times that they're leaving the bed, it's typically a little earlier than an hour and 45 minutes before sunset.
So it's almost just the opposite. The interpretation when we were looking at movement rate, the other set of graphs, if you remember in the morning, there wasn't near as much of a pattern except during the pre-rut, but we consistently saw the greater movement rate in the afternoon with the cool temperatures. And now we see more of a relationship with cold weather in the morning of how they're bedding down sooner. Notice those dark blue dots, they are definitely getting in their bed a little sooner. So it seems like that's a more consistent signal there. And then you get in the afternoon, and so them leaving the bed is not as consistent, but when they are on their feet, they are consistently moving at a greater rate of speed. So kind of hard for me to reconcile that entirely. But that's the data.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we can try and assign rationale to it, but I don't know. I think operating under the trends is probably better than forming a logical idea for it, because you might have a better you might think in your mind more in terms of that logical fallacy and then operate under that rather than the true results, and that might leak into other strategies within your hunting.
Yeah.
So that leads us back to our conclusions, which we started with. We are running long for listeners. For those that are still listening, we greatly appreciate it. We know that sometimes in this series, these episodes run long, but we tend to break stuff down quite a bit. Bronson, I want to thank you very much because you've given us quite a bit of your time. I kind of want to round this episode out with just some takeaways, maybe something that we would implement in our hunting style or take a look at and how it might change things. So I'll start with myself, just what I gathered from this data. And I already said earlier, I like to hunt morning. So again, looking into morning hunting is kind of reinforced by some of the data we had seen here, and really focusing in that pre-rut kind of for the Midwest, that kind of early mid-October time frame when we get those cold fronts in, because the data seems to really depict that there is these greater movement rates fairly consistently when we see that. And on top of that, if I'm looking at cold fronts in general, if I'm hunting in evening, right, I might look at that scrutinize that a little bit more closely than let's say the mornings in particular, because the data shows that movement rate is a little bit more consistent no matter what the phase is. Jacob, how would any conclusions that you drew from this that you might implement?
The conclusions I'm drawing from this are essentially that the mornings are really crucial. Morning hunting in the early season is showing greater correlation with the movement that the deer are doing. I'm seeing that if I need to be selective on my choice of what weather I'm hunting, which I don't get the opportunity to very often, I mostly can hunt whenever I can. I just hunt whenever I can. I hunt whenever I take days off. But if I have to be selective with weather in an attempt at a deer, it's more important for me to be cognizant of that weather in the lull periods of the season and the early season. And if I can get out during the rut, I should, and focus less on the weather during those times. And I drew a lot of the same conclusions you did as well, Josh. If you wouldn't mind, I have one more question that I kind of want to ask a little bit habitually, and it's kind of a difficult question sometimes for our researchers to ask or to answer. Bronson, do you think you'd be up to it? I know that wasn't much of a preface to it, but
I'll give it a stab. Sure.
All right. So you hear a lot by the hunting public, not the hunting public entity, but the hunting public of people that actually are hunting. You hear a lot of discussion on the ethics of teaching people more about hunting and educating people. And I know everyone in this podcast right now and most of the people listening are for the education of people and getting them into hunting. I kind of wanted to transcend just the data and our conclusions and maybe get into each of our guests' whys. Like, why are you on this journey? Because Josh and I are very familiar with why we are. What do you think about the ethics of producing studies and making deer hunting easier? Why do you think that it's important for us to invest in that and try to make deer hunting an easier endeavor, or maybe something that people may engage with more throughout these studies? And why are you on that mission yourself?
Um,
And you may
that's
disagree, but we'll
no,
give you the opportunity to say so.
that's a challenging question. It's probably most difficult for me to pontificate of whether it's good or bad to society or to hunting, but I'm on the journey because I'm curious. I'm on the journey because I'm enamored with deer. I want to continue to study deer. I want to manage deer. We conduct the science to better understand the species. We conducted this study, and by we, I have to include our state wildlife agency, the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. They're the ones that funded it as a response to hunters. And so literally in that region of the state, it was people asking the question, asking the state biologists, where did the deer go? How come we're not seeing them? You know, all of these types of questions. Where are they hiding? You know, this, that, and the other. And so that is really what the provided the funding and the impetus for collaring all these bucks. And so that enabled us to answer the primary research question, which was all about hunting pressure and the deer response to hunting pressure. But now that we have these data, we're able to go a step further and look at some more biological and ecological relationships that may not influence your hunting whatsoever. But I think it is just very interesting to understand what makes a deer tick.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And I don't know if it's going to make it that much easier, Jacob.
I think it will.
I think for some people, it may give them an edge. But for a lot of people are going to hunt the way they hunt.
Yep.
Either because they don't have very much time to hunt, so they hunt what they can hunt, or people are, we were talking about this on another podcast this morning about it is remarkable from Mississippi to Minnesota how many deer the average hunter kills a year. And the context of that conversation was in areas where the state agency is wanting people to kill more deer because density is getting out of control. It doesn't matter if you give them more days, more tags, more opportunity. Your average hunter is going to kill about 1.6, 1.7 deer. And that's due to the time that they have. That's due to freezer space. That's due to the money they have. They want to pay for the processing, or the time that they have to process their own deer, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot of hunters are going to hunt the way they hunt.
Yeah.
And then there's going to be the subset, probably your audience, that might take these types of data to hunt a little bit differently and hopefully be more successful.
And I can tell you our audience is not gigantic. We love and appreciate every single one of you guys, but the fact is, if you're listening to this, especially at this point in the podcast, you're in the minority and you're doing something more than the average guy, probably better than the average guy. As much as when you're paying attention to this space, it may seem like you're the only one that can't kill a deer. Well, your eyes are on it a lot more than the average guy too. So keep that in mind, you know, comparisons to Thief of Joy and all the stuff we talked about before. But I also want to point out, like, what you're doing has huge implications on deer management too, and what deer need to survive, not just in terms of, you know, in relation to hunters surviving from hunters, but their general tendencies and their nature. We're discovering quite a bit about through these studies, and that helps significantly with maintaining the population and ensuring that they're healthy for the future. You know, and we can't tell you how much we appreciate how you contribute to not only hunter success and knowledge of whitetails, but the ensuring that this species is going to be around for us to enjoy for many, many years.
Well, thank you very much. But I'll tell you this sincerely, it's a dream come true that I was able to make a living doing something like this is a dream come true for me. So I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to share it. I hope it brings other people as much joy as it's brought me.
Mm-hmm. It definitely makes a difference, and we thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I think that is a good place to end it there. Again, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Bronson, for generously giving us your time. We will put a link for Wildlife Investments, the buck movement, Understanding Buck Movement publication, and the YouTube video from the MSU Deer Lab in the show notes, so everyone can easily get to those. But we thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I've been your host, Josh Luck, joined by my co-host Jacob Sklenar, and our guest today was Dr. Bronson Strickland. Thank you, everyone.